Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Gray Maybe podcast. I'm so glad that you're joining us today. If you are a frequent listener, I thank you so much. And if you're just stopping in today, I hope you'll consider listening to some more episodes. Today, I have Jaayda Ellingham, licensed psychotherapist and LMFT. You may, if you're a fervent listener of the podcast, you have heard her before. And there's a reason why I keep bringing her on, besides her being one of my very, very best friends, is that she has a master's in this area and she's super, super well-versed in helping us figure out all the hard stuff. So today I'm bringing her on and we're going to talk about grief. Jaayda was a professional dancer. That's how we know each other. And she has made a transition to this line of work and she's been very successful in it. And she has, she's also a mother and she's had a wide variety, I'm sure, of griefs that she may or may not share with you today, but she's definitely in the specialty of dealing with loss and helping people process grief. So, Jaayda, welcome back. This is your third time back to the Gray Maybe podcast. Is there anything you want to add or?
Yeah. Let's talk about grief. It's fun.
Yeah, let's talk about the worst thing ever. Everybody, tell me your sadness.
No viewers. No.
Yeah, just let's talk about sad and grief. This is what I've said. I've said this in one way or another, kind of to every guest. I'm like, why do I pick a podcast talking about things that nobody wants to talk about and listening to things that nobody wants to listen, like the things that nobody wants to address? That's what I decide to talk about. So grief is probably the last on the list. I can't think of anybody who really wants to talk about grief. However, you are not going to escape it. So you may want to consider picking up some tools, because when you're in it, you'll be, probably begging for any kind of tools to get out of it. So Jaayda and I had a little meeting pre-pod and we just started riffing a little bit about what we wanted to talk about. And she brought up the 5 stages of grief. I know we have probably all heard about the 5 stages of grief. So if you're not familiar, I'll give you a review. So this is like a 5 bullet point, like here's your stages, right? So the first stage is denial, right? You're denying the situation. The second stage is anger, right? You're pissed. The third stage is bargaining. Like, I don't know if you're bargaining with a god or I don't know, you're just bargaining in your head. The fourth is depression, and the fifth is acceptance. And Jaayda wanted to talk a little bit about the 5 stages of grief, because I think she had an interesting take on it that I always agree with, because everything I believe is a little woo-woo.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, I think we need to speak to that. This is basically, it's outdated. There's no empirical evidence to support it. So I think we need to know this. Some people are still talking about it and using it as a way to help people manage grief, right? And when we talk about grief and we talk about management of our grief, this is probably, as a therapist, what I'm trying to help people stop doing. Stop managing, right? Stop managing your emotions. Stop managing your experience around grief. Right? Because if you are doing that, you're going to get yourself into a greater hole, right? Also, there are things that it doesn't account for. It doesn't account for culture, right? Some people have communal grieving processes, right? Religious grieving processes, right? Mm-hmm. They are not isolated. They are in a community really feeling connected, right? There are different belief systems around mortality. And, obviously grief is not just around mortality, but, these stages don't lend themselves to really expressing the full experience of what grief can look like for somebody. It really kind of can stigmatize someone's experience. So, if I'm working with grief, most people apologize. Right? So they begin to cry or they're feeling angry and they start apologizing. The other thing that they tend to do is, wonder about the timeline, right? No one's got time for grief, right? So
right. How long am I going to be here? How much time do I have to dedicate to this shitty part of my life right now? Like when, do it like next spring, next winter, like when can I, get my life back and feel better?
yeah, and that's what people are asking me. You know, when is this going to end?
Do you have that answer? Can you give it to me right now? Or
Well, if I was influencing, I would say with me, it's going to end tomorrow, right?
and when
No,
you're saying that, you're saying people guarantee this, right? Or people
yes,
kind of allude to this when they're in their, sometimes people who are maybe trying to make money off of
exploit
helping
it.
people, exploiting
Yeah,
people,
yeah.
that they might give you those type of guarantees, but in reality,
No, it's ambiguous, right? It's fluid.
well, nobody wants to hear that, Jaayda. We want
Oh my
magic
God,
pills.
it's you're right. It's gray, right? It's not black or white.
Yeah.
It's not black or white. And this is how we manage the anxiety of it all,
Hmm.
right? And not only that, there is a part of it that doesn't, you know, in our culture, in Western culture, there's a lot of isolation around grief because we're not okay with emotions,
Hmm.
raw emotions. We're okay with what appears to be positive, but we are not okay with someone's experience of anger, the injustice of it all,
Hmm.
right? With their experience of like that just raw, primal sadness,
Hmm.
because we feel it too,
Hmm. And I feel like
right?
any, if you are a person of color, you could magnify that by 3. If you are, when it comes to feelings, if you're a man, double it, like all the
There's no
different
room.
types of, right. Yeah.
Hmm. There's no room. So in some cultures, it's much harder to grieve because there's no room for grief,
Hmm.
right? Meaning culture, meaning, social economic status, race,
Hmm.
um, nationality,
Hmm.
gender, sexual orientation, right? So there's a
Hmm.
whole bunch of different factors of what culture is, right? So we have to look at that. That's really going to be the difference too when you're going to a therapist. Is
Hmm.
they're definitely looking at how culture impacts your experience,
And
and
hopefully you
there,
are. Hopefully you have found someone who is doing that. And
I
if you
mean,
don't feel like you are, find, there are people who do that. So find it.
yeah, or
Hmm.
say it, right? If you feel like you're
Hmm.
not being met in therapy, like, culture is not, you're feeling invalidated, let's say, because let's say you're going to a therapist who doesn't necessarily come from the same culture, and you're feeling that you can speak to it. And it's
Hmm.
really powerful in therapy to speak to something if you're feeling it's being missed between you and your therapist, right?
Like for
Because
you
therapy,
as a
oh yeah, I
person, like
love
for
it.
your growth, right? Like, and also
Oh,
for the therapist to help you, but for your therapeutic growth, if you want to get the most bang for your buck, voice
mm-hmm.
that.
Yeah,
Okay.
you have to advocate for yourself, right? You have to
That's
advocate
hard
for
though. You
yourself.
might be in therapy because you don't advocate for yourself.
Well, and that's the point. So a good therapist is going to know that, because if a
Right.
good therapist has taken inventory of all the different things that have contributed to where you are right now, right? Family
Yeah.
history, culture, biopsychosocial, right? Like there's all these factors that you're not going to get with just someone subscribing to the 5 stages of grief,
Right. Yeah.
right? You just dive in. Here it is.
Yep.
Where are you at? You in anger,
Yeah.
or you right?
Yep.
No. I'm actually
Point
feeling
to the chart.
relieved. What if you're feeling relieved?
Right. That's
Ooh,
not on there. There's something wrong
ooh,
with me.
yeah, that's ugly, right? My parent just passed away. I feel this sense of relief.
Hmm.
What?
I do.
Oh,
My dad was very ill for a long time.
mm-hmm.
He was, I don't know what his internal real experience was because I'm not him. And it was a brain thing. And although he seemed to be very aware of who everyone was and what was going on, I don't know the depth of that. People who are in dementia seem to be living in quite a different world than
Mm-hmm.
someone who's has Alzheimer's is someone who doesn't, it's all very different. So I don't know what his internal world was. But as someone who relies on their physicality for a great deal of their livelihood, purpose, experience, and joy, watching him become completely disabled, where my mother had to do every single thing for him.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I couldn't imagine that he was having a great time. And so when he passed, and luckily it was a fairly quick, in the hospital a week later passing, after we moved him to hospice, like there was a lot of relief that he didn't have to do that anymore, that my mom didn't have to do that anymore, that I didn't have to constantly anticipate when that was going to happen, or that I wasn't going home enough for his final moments, and what was he actually experiencing, and is he suffering, like all those things. And my brother to, in a similar way, but more because he was closer by. So he had more responsibilities with my mom to help with that, everybody, I think there was some relief. I think that was universal, even if my family might not have been able to say that word, but I think that was definitely, yeah. So if you're feeling relief, where is that on the 5 stages of grief? That kind of throws you for a loop. And I think one of the things we discussed previous to us starting to record here was that to me, having a bullet point of these are the stages you go through was very reminiscent of when I had my knee surgery and I was in physical therapy, and they would show me this chart and they would say, this is where you start and this is where you end. And it's supposed to be this like line from the bottom going up at a diagonal, like, a constant upward, diagonal line. And mine was like all over the place. And, I would go in there and sometimes I would have these physical therapists. I only had one that I liked. The rest of them to me were trash. And they made me feel shame about where I was in the process. And I would try to explain to them, I'm like, okay, so I'm a dancer and I need to do this, this, and this. And they would kind of be like, that's cool. Why don't you run on the treadmill? And I was like, look, I'm not going to run unless I'm running to an airplane gate. I don't need to be running. It hurts my patellas. Like, let's not. Can I do something else? And when I would, gain more flexibility in my knee, which if you're a dancer, you understand how important flexibility of the knee is to get your leg completely straight. And if you do have a hyperextension, to get back that hyperextension, anytime I would get more flexibility, I would lose strength. And they were looking pretty much only for strength because that's all that mattered to them, because their professions didn't align, what they thought of as sports and things were not as specific as dance as an athletic, deity. And so it reminded it, like looking at these 5 stages of grief, and you saying that it's not linear, you could be cycling through, like all of these are valid, right? Like denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. Mm-hmm. Yes, you may relate to all that. There also may be,
you may have none of it.
Right. Or none of it. You may have relief and just be like, thank God, it's over. But like, or you could be cycling in and around those things over and over again, mm-hmm. and be like, why am I not making my way up this chart or ladder progress, or down this list? Right. Exactly. And then you mentioned that's usually when the shame enters, right? Like, mm-hmm. oh, there's something wrong with me. Why can't I get over this? It's been and enough time.
Really, really complicated, right? So this is where you get into complicated grief. Right, mm-hmm. is when you start to obsess around maybe even that. Mm-hmm. What's wrong with me? Mm-hmm. Why can't I get through it? So and so got through it, right? They're telling me that the experts are telling me that something's wrong with me. They're sending me a really strong message that something is wrong with me, right? So in therapy, ideally you have a therapist who can just sort of be with the ambiguity. Mm-hmm. Right? One moment you come in and you have this heightened realization of like some of the values underneath the grief, which is a really beautiful thing. And then the next session, you're fucking angry. Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful thing. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Because underneath all of that is important experience that really, helps shape, mm-hmm. right? And creates that growth. You were talking about society is really about like pushing, and we've talked a little bit about this before in past podcasts, right? Is that I was going to say past sessions, mm-hmm. right? But like
they are sessions, they're free sessions for me.
Yeah. It's progress based, right? Our society is progress based. It's we need to see progress because we strive, right? But progress is moving through the present moment as it is. Mm-hmm. It is not an achievable, thing, right? It's not,
okay, so pause on that, because this is a big deal. So a lot of times, like if you're in the mind frame of working on yourself, going to therapy, self-help, all the things, right? And you're, noticing maybe your character flaws or things that you want to change or your reaction to things. A lot of people talk about their progress, right? Like, well, a year ago, I wouldn't have done, especially if you're in the recovery rooms, you hear people talking about progress a lot. You're like, a year ago, I would have done this, this, and this. Instead of today, I'm doing this, this, and this. And I think that's interesting that you said it's like in the actual present moment. So it's even less about what happened a year ago or 2 years ago. It's like in this moment, right this second,
Mm-hmm.
what is the progression? Like what
Mm-hmm.
is the progress?
Yeah. So, for example, like let's say I'm working with a client who has had compounded grief, right? Let's say they've lost
And
somebody.
what's compounded? Yeah, just walk us through it.
Is experiencing grief and not being able to process it until the next grief occurs, right? So it keeps
Mm-hmm.
compounding, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
haven't processed your grief, right? So let's say I'm working with somebody and then they start to exhibit or present depressive symptoms, right?
Mm-hmm.
I am really looking at, because depression is generalized, it becomes really big and generalized, and so part of the work with depression is really finding the difference, right? And how you do that is finding it in the present moment. So guiding people into the present moment really allows for them to see where there's nuance. This is not in the 5 stages of grief, right? So like, let's say
What?
I'm
I've
working.
been lied to.
Everybody has,
Yeah.
right? But it's hard because in the present moment you have to meet it, and in that you're meeting it, but you're also meeting it in the presence of another person, which is incredibly hard for people, really,
Mm-hmm.
to show up in their grief as someone is bearing witness to it. Because really, what happens when it's like moving is that the therapist or whoever is with that person, doesn't have to be a therapist, can be another person, a friend, a family member, someone in your community, right? The transformative, most healing thing is that the person that you're with can feel it too
Mm-hmm.
and stay with it.
But that's what we don't want to do.
That's what's so hard to do. And that
Yeah.
really is, if we're talking about growth, progress, we're talking about being able to be with whatever feeling comes up in the presence of another.
Mm-hmm.
And in that way, we give people the room to grieve. We give them the room to have whatever experience. So somebody with depression, coming back to it, right? They're in session. They're like, I'm really depressed. And I will basically, what they won't look at is that they have compounded grief. I'm like,
Right.
that's a lot of grief. Oh no, but it's a me thing, right? So I've
Mm-hmm.
personalized it. No, it's a me thing. No, I'm like, but let's look at it. Let's look at all that you've experienced in this year. That is a lot of stress on your body.
Mm-hmm.
And when you undergo that stress in your body, your nervous system takes time to work through it and feel safe again, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens sometimes in session is you'll have a very nuanced experience where the person is crying, or maybe let's say they're numb or dissociated, then they start to cry, and then they start to laugh, and then they start to get angry, and then, right? And what I'll point out is look at all that experience there. You weren't
Mm-hmm.
just numb or depressed or um, tapped out. You were engaging in experience. You laughed with me.
Mm-hmm.
You're hilarious, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
then there's a joining in that and a witnessing in that, and the person feels seen and heard, and they move through it a little easier. But it's in that moment, and they can then get stuck again. I mean, that's just how
Mm-hmm.
it is. But there's a relief in
And
that.
I like that you talked about, uh, like having someone witness the sharing of grief or the experience, right? And someone witnessing it. And it made me think about I talk about a lot on all the podcasts, that, I'm in 12-step programs and it's, if you've ever been in group therapy, which I did not like group therapy. I can't speak on support groups because I haven't been to an in-person support group. So I can't speak on that. But in the 12-step meetings, there's a lot of boundaries, or not boundaries, but like rules and how things are done. Like you have a certain amount of time to share. You're not allowed to comment on other people's share. You're not allowed to respond to other people's share. It's just very much like people sharing and letting people share and listening to other people share. And I'm wondering, like, this is kind of a hard, this came into my head and I don't know if I'm going to be able to speak to it in a way that it just, in my head, I was like, oh, wait, something might be happening that we're not really thinking about. So doing that in person is extremely therapeutic. Not always right at once, like not like you're going to do it once and be healed, but the act of like saying your truth, speaking what you would call like a secret, like something you're keeping inside that's not healthy, right? Saying it out loud to a group of people, and they don't say anything back. They don't give you advice. They're not trying to fix it. They're not trying to like, which is a lot of times what happens with therapy. Like one of my favorite things is when I'm telling someone, oh, I'm having this problem. They're like, what does your therapist say? I'm like, my therapist doesn't say shit because that's not their job to fix it for me. It's not their job to like even really make suggestions. It's just their job to kind of listen and help me find my own way
And they
through.
go, what are they doing?
Right? They don't get it. Like they're really,
I can do it. Yeah.
it's like when someone's not familiar with therapy and you tell them, like they're like, well, you know, what is their therapist or what is your therapist? I'm like, oh yeah, that's not that. Their eyes, like their whole, you can see their brain kind of like what like what are you doing then, what is this? And so, but I'm wondering, getting to like okay, online now we will see people openly grieve, and I think that's great as far as people sharing their process and normalizing grief and giving, you know, like I've seen people write really phenomenal things that are going through grief. And I think it's very like touching and very relatable and very important and amazing. However, what do you think that there could be some not great things if people were just
To rely on that?
yes, or just even like that's their way. I'm not saying there's any right way or wrong way to grieve, but do you think the connection of relating to someone in that moment is, and that getting taken away and posting the grief story and piecing out, do you think
You're missing some
yes,
valuable process of it.
okay,
Right? Like I don't think it has to do with virtual versus not. I think it has to do with the ability to run. You know what I mean? So
right,
so in grief, people run.
yeah,
They run, and some ways that I'd be looking at if someone is running is if they're problem solving, they're running. They're running away from it, right?
I
So if
love
you're
a good problem solve.
yeah, I mean that sometimes is practical, but not with grief.
Mm-hmm.
You don't meet goals with grief. You know what I mean? That's just not how it works, right? To process grief is again to bear witness to it and to feel received. Okay, so if somebody is problem solving, that's a way that they're avoiding grief. If somebody is sort of even placating, right?
What does that mean? Can you give us an example?
Like I do this because I feel like it's, and when I move my body this way, I feel like that placating comes from a state of anxiety, right? So placating is someone like is having, someone says, oh, I lost somebody, and they start to cry. Oh, you know, I can see like there's just a lot of doing too much.
Right.
Doing too
Okay.
much,
Right.
right? You're still robbing the person of space.
Right.
Right. And what I'm saying is like bearing witness to is not avoiding or escaping any sort of felt state within yourself. So you can do it virtually, but you'd have to stay in it. Right. So I work virtually. I do telehealth. That's what I do.
Right.
But like they can't go away unless they press end.
Right. I'm leaving the room.
Now, right. And I can see a lot of escape behaviors as somebody is trying to process through grief, and I name it. So I'm really showing up in it, right? Because I'm like, hey, I noticed you just changed the subject. What happened there? Then usually what comes up is a feeling. Okay. Right. That feeling is there. Right. Can you be with it? It's okay. Right. So that I am like validating, right? Like it's very normal to have that feeling. And maybe you can soften in that. Right. Because unprocessed grief looks crazy.
What does that mean? It looks. Is that why everyone's losing their mind everywhere?
Yes,
like these,
yes, it's unprocessed grief.
Yeah.
Right. So unprocessed grief looks anxious. It looks depressed. It looks like PTSD. It looks like lashing out behaviors. Right. It
mental
looks
breakdowns.
Less honest. Yeah, it looks less
mentee
honest.
bees.
Yeah. Right. So usually, if I see someone that's highly anxious or just sort of, I'm like, what are they running from? Right.
Everything, Jaayda, fucking everything.
Right. And so then I might say, if the therapeutic relationship is there, I might say, are you running right now? Where are you going? Where are you going?
to a land of relaxation.
Well, right. And so what happens is if unprocessed grief will show up in the middle of the night, it's going to show up as insomnia.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to show up as, right, overthinking, these
Mm-hmm.
patterns that occur, right? And these are strategies of avoidance. So for therapy is therapist is going to look at strategies of avoidance, and we're going to try to like address those strategies of avoidance. So coming full circle, what you're saying is it's just too easy to avoid in that environment, right? You're going to see many
Mm-hmm.
people tapping out, saying their story and running. It's very easy also, and it can be an exercise to put, let's say, post your grief online, post your grief in social media.
And I want to be really clear. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with posting your experience, and I think it's helpful. I'm talking about like if you're not talking to your friends, if you're not talking to people that are close to you, if you don't have a therapist, if you're not in a support group, if you're not and you're just posting online and then piecing out. I think there could be like there might be
do you see
some
how
room
you're
for
doing
you
with
to
your
get
body?
some more help. Yeah, well, nobody else can unless they're going to watch this on the socials. But I'm
What are you doing with your body?
I'm pretending to do the post, and then I'm dodging, and then I'm like,
Yes,
peace out.
right.
I don't have to deal with sitting in that moment of dealing with other people witnessing me.
Mm-hmm. And there it is.
Yeah.
Right? So you did that in your body language. I'd be noticing that in session, let's say, right? So you're doing this thing with your body language. It tells me that you're trying to escape something, and you're just sort of peeking in, trying to escape, but then sort of maybe seeing how you're received.
Right. Checking in when you're ready.
How many likes did I get?
Right.
What did somebody heart that grief?
Right.
Right. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah.
You feel satisfied with that answer?
Yeah. Well, and again, I don't want to dissuade anyone from putting anything on social media because it can be helpful to have other people, and it might be your first step in one direction. You may be testing the water, right? There's a lot of different ways and processes, and there is no one process or perfected process for anyone. It's all a different road. That being said, you and I made a little list of different kind of categories of grief, because also, I think, and I might have already said on one of the episodes that, the big ones we all get, right? Like the big ones we all not even tolerate, but like we accept, right? Oh, a death of a family member, a death of a significant other, a death of offspring, a death of a pet, even. Yes, a pet is very high up there because so many people really take that job very, very seriously, and that relationship is very, very intimate.
Yes.
But there are some other things that I think we don't address, and because we don't address it or we don't validate it, it can become like these mini unseen dirty corners of our emotional body that don't get cleaned up and could become compound. I have long since believed that the pandemic created a ton of grief. And just because maybe people have felt like they've gone back to their lives or a different life doesn't negate the fact that there was a stretch of time where some people were losing people they knew, family members, the fear that they were going to lose people around you, the loss of economic stability, the loss of livelihood that for some people, myself included, has not fully recovered, 3-4 years later. There was so much, and just watching people grieve, there was so much watching people having to, and if you were a nurse on the front lines, oh, you went to war. And you're never going to change my mind about that. You guys went to war. You have PTSD. You're not going to convince me different. If you say you don't have PTSD, I'm going to assume you're a sociopath, because that was not what y'all signed up for. You all signed up to do your shift and deal with the people.
Vicarious trauma. Yeah.
Yes.
Vicarious trauma, grief, all of that, right? Being with family members, not having an explanation. Oof.
Yeah,
right?
dealing with the family members who couldn't see their loved ones, letting people say their final words on FaceTime, on iPads. I don't know how you recover from this. So, just the pandemic was a grief that I think was compounded in its own way. And I think people, just because we've moved on past through whatever, I don't know necessarily that everybody really dealt with that. And I think if right now me bringing it up makes you irritated, that might be a little bit of like a
Red flag.
meter. Yeah, for real. Like if I'm bringing this up right now and you're like, oh my God, you're right. Like, oh my God, thinking about that time. Yeah, there's a lot there that went on that, I'm just so glad to be out of it that I haven't really had to like do anything to like, I don't know. And then if you're like, oh, just quit talking about it already,
It's
like
over.
it's
Well, but
over. We're done.
but this is what we're talking about with timelines, right? This doesn't matter
Right.
what grief we've experienced. People have a timeline. They have a
Mm-hmm.
timeline that they're willing to be with it, and people know that are
Mm-hmm.
experiencing grief, right? So let's say I'm still grieving, missed opportunities within the pandemic. That was very personal for me, right? I had
Mm-hmm.
Colby March 1st, 2020. March
Mm-hmm.
1st, 2020 ushered into a pandemic, missed the cutoff of lockdown, thank God, right?
Mm-hmm.
But my parents did not get to meet him for 8 months because they're in
Ooh.
Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And when I did take him on the plane, there were still so many unknowns. So
Right.
I was really taking a chance with an 8-month-old
Right.
myself, shielded up, right? I,
Yeah.
I had to go to Canada and I had to be quarantined for 2 weeks and then I left.
Right.
I day after quarantine, I left, right?
Yeah.
But I was angry.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as my own personal experience, and I've since then processed through it, but like I was angry at the feeling that people were denying it,
Right.
denying the grief, denying my grief, denying the idea of a pandemic, that
Mm-hmm.
this thing was happening.
Mm-hmm.
um, I'm overreacting. Why don't you just do this, right?
Mm-hmm.
That sort of compounds my grief, right?
Mm-hmm.
It makes me very angry.
Mm-hmm.
And then I have an associated process of that, which is
Mm-hmm.
judgment, right? Because I can't
Right.
control any of the factors, right? So, this is the point, is like we are not going to escape grief in this lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
It is unavoidable. If you love, you will grieve. If you connect, you will grieve, right? If you don't connect, you will grieve. You're going to
Mm-hmm.
grieve, and so you better get real good at your process.
Mm-hmm.
That's a threat. No, but
Yeah.
that sound like a threat. But that is what it is, and that really is what therapy is being radical about your process, really owning it,
Mm-hmm.
and sharing it with another person who can accept it and validate it as well, and feel, feeling like you're being seen
Mm-hmm.
there, and then you move through it a little bit easier.
Yes. We talked already a little bit about anticipatory grief. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that or elaborate, expand on anticipatory griefs. And I think it can be, I know probably the most well-known one is like someone who is chronically ill or
Mm-hmm.
not chronically ill, but like terminally ill, right? You know
Mm-hmm.
that this day is coming, you just don't know when. And sometimes those of us that are highly anxious can anticipatory grief every single thing with every single one all the time. I seem to, the more I love something, the more I am obsessed with the anticipatory grief of it, right? So pets, I do this with a lot, people that are very close to me. When my anxiety is up, I am anticipating grief. So,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that or.
You're anticipating a loss, right?
Mm-hmm,
Because you will lose.
mm-hmm.
You're good,
You're
and
gonna
that's not
lose.
that's not a very fun thing to think about, right? But it also forms how you want to be. So yeah, when we're thinking about anticipatory grief, the first thing that will come to mind is grieving, anticipating the grief or the loss of a loved one due to chronic illness. But there's much more. There's transitions, like let's say I'm, and we'll get into this, right? But
Mm-hmm,
like I'm a dancer or I'm an athlete and I'm
mm-hmm,
running out of time, right? I
mm-hmm,
start to feel my body moving a certain direction and it's not looking good. And
mm-hmm,
I recognize that there's this looming idea of a transition coming, and I have to mourn the identity who I built myself up to be. And that is so hard,
mm-hmm,
right? And then I have to reimagine who I am, but I have to let go. Oh God,
mm-hmm,
what does that look like, right?
mm-hmm,
There's also, anticipating a divorce. I work with couples
mm-hmm,
who are trying to figure it out, and like for a therapist, you're not, I'm not really invested in the outcome. I don't care if you stay together, you get divorced.
Right. Because from your point of view, and anyone who's not involved in those two people's situation, you're like, well, I just want what's best for these people. And it may not
Mm-hmm.
be for them to be together. And
Mm-hmm.
even though it's painful because maybe they prefer, comfort over happiness, or maybe they will have a hard time financially without the situation, or maybe because they have abandonment issues. And I know they have abandonment issues. This is just going to fuel that. Like, you could still see past and be like, yeah, but there's got to be something better than this. What's going on here? And if you can see that, you're like, look, it doesn't matter to me. You either find a way to live in this, or you'll be better off without it in a certain way.
Yeah, right. And also, when you're working with couples or families, there's grievances, right? Things that were unresolved, right? So, that's like the complicated grief, right? Is that like something wasn't resolved,
Mm-hmm.
and now how do I manage that? And when you're working with couples, sometimes, you'll see management looking like excessive fighting or conflict, escalation of conflict, right? And really, if you dig into the present moment, which is not fun for anybody, only for me, I'm just kidding, because I'm sick. No, is that there is a grievance there, and if I can catch it in the present moment, and I can get that person to soften, they become more directed, more aligned to what is actually going on, rather than this distortion that is occurring, right, in behaviors. Right?
Can you give us like a example of that, like of the scenario, and then them softening, and then
Okay, let's look at a couple that is most likely entering into divorce.
Okay.
Right? There's a lot of grievances. There's going to be a lot of things that they haven't really processed that probably need to be processed. But in the present moment, there's going to be probably behaviors that look like threats.
Mm. Right. Like, if you leave me, you're never going to see the kids again. It's kind of a major one. People do that all the time.
Yeah, but they don't state them.
No, they're just like,
they're in behaviors.
Yeah.
And so, okay, you're staying with the person for the reason of like to prevent the threat.
Right.
Right. But really, it's like this unprocessed grievance that needs to be processed in the present moment so we can release that behavior, because that behavior is not in service of, right? So therapists, you're looking at the value system as a map, right? I am anyway. And I might start to understand that a couple has a strong value of connection and growth and these things. And so I'm going to go, oh, well, that's interesting. So that threat is really counter to that value system. So I help them identify, well, is that aligned to your collective value system? Will this help you, really live a life worth living, right? If you're holding animosity, you're holding these grievance, and then you're playing into these distorted behaviors, is that really going to lend itself to a good life for you, your child, your ex, right? Yeah. So I again, the power is in the present moment. It always is. You can do a bunch of worksheets in therapy, but the present moment, if you can sort of hook into the present moment, allow yourself to receive it as it is, and really sort of externalize any symptoms that might occur, like any feelings, any behaviors, right? You don't make it about you. You really have a good chance to just actually move through it. And it doesn't mean that it's not going to show up. It doesn't mean that it magically goes away, but your resiliency and your grit to move through these experiences improves, becomes better.
Right. Now, yes, absolutely. So we talked actually, I don't know if we did. Did we talk about shock? Like this one, I think, is like what I think most people are very, as far as grief goes, comfortable in acknowledging, or comfortable in like the knowing of, which is like shock grief, which is like an accident happens, someone, something terrible happens out of nowhere, there was no forewarning. It's incredibly, jarring, that type of grief. Do you want to speak on that at all, or have any thoughts?
I have a lot of thoughts about that.
I bet you do.
I'm like, as you're saying it, I can feel myself well.
Right.
Right? Like, here it is.
Yeah.
Right? You can't, people who are listening can't, maybe you can hear it, but like, when you say that, and this is grief too, right? You're just saying something, and here comes the flood of my memories.
Right.
And this is what you're helping someone stay with. My dad had, oh my God. Okay. My dad had an aortic aneurysm in March.
Out of nowhere.
Out of nowhere, healthy. And out of nowhere, I get a text message from my mom. She's in the ambulance, and he's not going to make it because you don't make it through that. I was in a panic. Like, kind of felt like I was doing circles. Thank God I have a partner who is really good in crises, because that's what she does. But yeah, like, she was able to book the flights, do the things, right? Take care of the kids, right? And so I flew home, and I was there in the hospital. He did make it through. He made it through the surgery, and but it was shocking. It's something that's unexpected, and my nervous system for 3 months following, he survived, right? And he's doing really well, which is great, a strong man, right? But like, my nervous system was in fight flight for about 3 months after. I was dissociated. Right. I felt like I left my body in Canada.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is he lived, and you still, this is the right, like, the grief is still there, whether, and maybe it would be more if he didn't, and maybe it would be different type, but it's still like that experience brought you to that grief. It had the trauma of that experience of having to like speed your way through that emotional experience is still legitimate. And I think this speaks to our how I view our society. Like, you telling this story, how many people listening right now are like, oh, well, good thing oh, that's so great. Like, it brought you relief to know that he lived, right? Right. Oh, good. She doesn't have to deal with it. Oh, good. She can move on. But look, you listen to her. It doesn't matter, actually, because it still lives there so painfully, right? That experience, right?
Yeah. In your body. Right. So like, I'm telling you, 3 months, roughly 3 months, I was in and out of my body. Like, that's my body trying to come back to safety. Because in that, there was a recognition of mortality. Right? It just was not expected. And also, right, because this is why the 5 stages of grief do not apply, right? Doesn't really, inform this type of experience, right? But also, like, in that experience, because there was a coming together with my family, there was a deeper, closer connection, being on the same page, like making sure that we all are contributing, right? There's a really strong community factor and connection that occurred in that grief as well, which was transformative for my family, I believe. I mean, maybe I'm the only one that knows this, but it was for me.
You and I both had that, and that happened pretty close timelines, because your dad had his accident right before my dad went into the hospital, and you were he was already healed up and moving forward when my dad went into the hospital, but you had talked about that, kind of reuniting of your family and the solidarity there, and the same thing happened with my family. My brother and I, we're not particularly close. I do think we're closer now, and we talk much more now than we ever did before. And it's not about how's mom doing? It's just, we have our own, sitting and waiting for my dad to die, because basically we got him into hospice and he was on all the drugs, and it was just a matter of how long it was going to take for the body to finally give up. You're sitting there and you're just waiting. And you have no idea when it's going to happen. You hope it's when you're there, but we went home to sleep every night. We didn't sleep in the room with him, and that weird waiting, you just start filling the time with conversations. And so my brother would just be talking about and I would just be talking about all kinds of things. And we've kind of found out that we have come around to much similar ideas, you know, that we didn't once before. And so we have a lot more to talk about nowadays. And, you know, we've grown closer through talking about my dad and his situation and how he grew up and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So that both happened for us around the same time. So that was definitely a gift of that scenario for me anyways. I'm not sure if you saw it that way.
I saw it that way. I mean, I saw it that
Yeah.
way for you, and I also saw it that way for myself, right?
Yeah.
And that's something that is, you know, embedded into the coming back to my body,
Right.
right? You know, also being in a hospital, like when you're not knowing if the person will survive, right? Your loved one is surviving, right? You're also in a hospital setting, and there's a lot of like beep.
Yeah, there's just so much. Yeah.
What was that?
Yes.
You know, and yeah, and it's like that is traumatizing too.
The
right?
smells, sights, sounds, and energy of hospitals are something else. If you're energy sensitive, if you're highly sensitive, if you avoid hospitals, if you don't like being in hospitals. I don't think anybody likes being in hospitals, but I think there's some people who are much more affected by that than others. You know, and also, if there are scenarios in grief where someone passes or has a near passing experience that tear families apart. And I do want to recognize that as well, because that could be an extra assault or an extra grief where you used to be so close to these people and now you're fighting over assets or you're fighting over how treatment plans, you know, like not everyone in surrounding these already tough decisions agrees, right? And that can, I thought I knew my sister so well. I don't have a sister. I'm just saying that, you know, I thought I knew, you know, what was best, or I can't believe they're not fulfilling my so-and-so's wishes. You know, this is just again, and that nothing brings that out in people more than death or grieving and hurt and, you know, whatnot. So I do want to acknowledge that as well.
Right? It brings up your own mortality, and this is not a fun fact. We will all die.
Right.
And many of us will incur, you know, many deaths are lifetime, whether it be a death of a career, a death of a relationship, a death of a pet, a death of a loved one, our own health and wellness, right? We, you know, who we thought we were. And this is all very important. And so, you know, again, not going to escape it, right? So you got to learn how to process it, and you have to learn how to be with the present moment as it is, and have a little bit more of a, you know, a curiosity about it without getting fused to it being you. It's a very human experience. Yeah. So, you know, some of the recommendations is to self-validate, right? That's what a therapist is going to do. A lot of validations, right? A lot of normalization. You're going to do a lot of that, and a lot of reflection. And so you can apply that to your own experience every single day. And if you do that, you'll move through any hard emotion much easier.
I want to talk about, I love that you said that. I agree with everything. And I have to agree because you're an expert, so I'm not going to argue with an expert. I want to talk a little bit about, this might be redundant, but I think it's still valid. So recovery, and that can be recovery from an injury. That can be recovery from a sickness. This can be recovery from substance abuse. There is so much grief in recovery. And it's so of the variety blend, right? Sitting in recovery rooms, one of the things that people have said is that recovery is the unthawing of grief. And I think that that's like so poignant, because people come into these rooms and they are unthawing, and what they are unthawing is grief that is unprocessed. And that is usually why they are doing the substance or the behaviors that they're doing. And so they get to the bottom of that usually in these recovery rooms. And I'm sure that is also what happens in the rooms of therapists, is that unthawing of grief. In addition, the kind of grief that accompanies an injury or a sickness, of just not being able to have and do the things that you were used to doing and having, and missing out and being afraid, will I ever be the same again? You know, sitting in the place of having to recover from something is sitting in a state of kind of grief. If you want to be, at least that's how my experience was with my big injury. I'm not sure if other people can relate, but that's kind of how it was for me. Is there anything you want to add to that?
I think you're right. Right? You have to, I, it's best to look at behaviors as just this thing that happens when you don't process something,
Hmm.
right? And not to put a lot of attention to it. Yeah, like alcoholism is a behavior,
Hmm.
and it's there to cope with something.
Hmm.
Okay, and then my question is, what are you avoiding? Right? So I'm therapists are not, well, I am not, I shouldn't speak to all therapists, they all have different ways of working, right? But for
Hmm.
me, I'm like less concerned about the behavior as long as you're safe, right? So I'm more about, reducing harm.
Hmm.
Yeah. But really about like tapping into what you're avoiding. And if I can do that, I'm really tapping into the grief, right? So when you're looking at like any sort of recovery from an assault, recovery from um, maybe transition from, if you're trans, let's say, like, right,
Hmm.
and you inherently know that, like, in your transition to who you are, you're
Hmm.
trans, right, in your transition to who you know you are authentically, um, the people around you are going to have to grieve.
Right.
They're going to have to recover, and
Right.
you really don't want to put them through that, or you're going to be abandoned, or there's going to be some sort of consequence to you becoming authentically you, right? That's the deal, right? Even if you're coming out,
Hmm.
so this is LGBTQ plus A, right?
Hmm.
Ideas, right? Coming out, you're not the only one coming out.
Hmm.
Everybody's coming out.
Right.
Like,
Right.
if you can do it alone, that's why people do it in secrecy, right?
Right.
Right? You're all coming out of the closet,
Yeah.
and
I
you can't control the outcome.
I have a I had a previous relationship with someone who transitioned early. I was, like very young adult. One of my partners transitioned later in life, and I was shocked at how different their personality was. So I found myself kind of grieving who I thought they were, or who they had
Mm-hmm.
presented to me, or and at the same time feeling really bad that this person didn't get to be their authentic self.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we're talking opposite sides of the personality. We're talking someone I knew as very soft spoken, shy, introspective. In actuality, post transition was outgoing, very not shy at all, like
Mm-hmm.
not introspective, like just like out there. And it was a trip because when someone says you call them their dead name, you are referencing someone who may not be present anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And that may be really difficult for people around you who very much loved who that person was, or who you thought they were. And it is a little, indulgent because you're like, but I had these, this is who I expected you to be, like this is
Mm-hmm.
who you
Yeah.
showed me you were, and that's what I
Yeah.
wanted. And,
Or
but it
I
may
had
not
a
have
daughter.
been
I had a
authentic.
daughter. Yeah, I had a
Right. I had a
daughter.
daughter and now I have a son, or I had a son and
Yeah.
now I have a daughter and I don't know how to process that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is a unique kind of grief. Not unique. I mean, it's unique, and I'm glad we're talking about it because I think it's a conversation that's ready to be had and something that there's a lot of room for right now,
Mm-hmm.
to be recognized. You brought up briefly assault, like, sexual assault, kind of traumas on that level. Like, do you want to speak about those griefs a little bit, or any experience in that you have in those, helping people process that?
Yeah, well, so, oftentimes I work with compounded grief, right? I'm working with compounded
Hmm.
trauma, right? So developmental trauma, which is really the foundation for safety, to be able to be resilient through other traumas that you might incur over a lifetime, right? And
Hmm.
and so yeah, assault is somebody took something from you, right?
Hmm.
They took they you no
Your
longer have
power,
control.
your
Yeah, your power,
body,
your
yeah,
control.
your control,
Yeah, your
your
innocence,
if you if you
your
yep, your
view on
innocence,
life, your
maybe
safety.
you had a hobby you liked and they were a
Hmm.
part of that hobby and then they
Hmm.
fucked it up and now you don't like that
Yeah,
hobby anymore. Like, yeah.
and all the triggers around it, all the triggers around it.
Hmm.
Your hair, Say the person yanked on your hair and you
Right.
identified with your hair, now your hair is toxic, you know?
Right. Right.
Yeah. And so, you're really having to process that grief and the transformation of identity, really,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is transition, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah. I mean, it all really I say it's not rocket science, right? It's not like
Right.
you really can get down to all the ailments in our society. I really feel it, and the center of it is usually grief and trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Trauma, grief, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's traumatizing. You have to work through that process, and then there's grief that you have to work
Mm-hmm.
through.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I feel that on a deep level. Let's talk about ambiguous griefs. So this could be like in a bucket of odds and ends. I think it could also be, things that don't fit in other categories. I think this could also be, I have a really hard time with this one. I'm trying to work on my toxic expectations. So, like in the recovery rooms, there is a couple sayings that go, like expectations are premeditated resentments, or expectations are resentments under construction. And I'm not saying that you can't expect your significant other to remember your birthday or love you or give you things. Like, it's not those types of expectations. It's expectations like, my birthday's coming up and oh, maybe everybody will throw me a giant surprise party and everybody I ever loved will be there and I will feel so this and I will feel that when this happens. And then it doesn't happen. And now you're like, oh my God, devastated.
But neither did you didn't voice it either, right? So you
No, of
expected
course
it in
not.
your
No,
mind.
no, they're all expectations, right?
Yeah.
It's so, but I'm using that as an example as like, a lot of times I have the profound ability to magnetize my desires to a place that are probably fairly unrealistic. And in that moment, it's not a big deal to dream big, but it is if when those dreams don't happen immediately, you're like depressed about it. Like that's not the best system. I've said before, I have to try to make the bar so low I can step over it because that also has to do with my expectations. I need to set my expectations so low I can step over them. Like they have to be low because I will whip myself up to a frenzy. Then when those things don't get, fulfilled, I'm upset and I'm disappointed. And all of that could have been avoided if I just managed my expectations a little bit better. But so in that realm of, since that's something I do, these are, when you have things you've planned for the future in your mind, like these little things that you have that you think that you see, and then your life may not be going that direction or something happens and that's not an option anymore, like that can trigger some really deep, serious grief. And now it's not even something that happened. You're not getting anything taken away that happened. You're not having, oh, remember the good times with that thing or person. Like you don't even have that. There is like, how do you have like the ability to have nostalgia for something that's never happened is quite a head trip. And I think ambiguous griefs can kind of almost fit under that category because they're things that haven't happened, but they're things that you wanted to happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I think, I mean, when I hear all this, right, I hear about what I'm hearing is needs, a need to be met, right,
Mm-hmm.
and expectation of that need being met, and not the articulation of that need being met or the advocating for that need being met. And when I think of that, I go into attachment.
Mm-hmm.
So my mind then goes attachment, and as a child, needs not getting met. Are you writing this down?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I take notes all the time.
Do you?
Yeah, I take little notes so I don't forget what I want to say. Or
Yeah, it's like an attachment grief, an attachment wound, right?
mm-hmm.
It's like my needs weren't met as a kid, and and I want this need desperately needs to be met as an adult, but yet I'm not being clear because I'm
Mm-hmm.
also probably pretty afraid of it too.
Right.
If I could get rejected, right? Because as a child, I'm used to that disappointment. People disappoint me. I'm
Mm-hmm.
disappointed by others. So it's
Mm-hmm.
really hard for a person who has had that attachment grief to be able to advocate for their needs, because with that comes the anxiety of rejection.
Mm-hmm. I think if you're listening and you're anything like me, I have so many conversations in my head that oftentimes I have to remind myself that I haven't said that out
You didn't say
loud.
it. Yeah. Yeah.
And I not only did I not say it out loud, but I didn't say it out loud to the right person or
Right.
people. So if
Because it's
you're like,
vulnerable.
yes, and oftentimes I'll have conversations with people and they'll be like, so I said, I'm tired of this shit. I want something better. And I'll be like, did you say that to them? And they'll say, well, no. I do that all the time. Because I want to know. I'm like, did you say that to them? Or, oh, well,
Yeah.
no, I said, you ask people when people tell you they've said something, ask
That's
them,
what
did you say
I
that to
always
them?
say.
Yeah.
No, I
Did,
always say
did you,
that. Yeah.
did you say
You
that? And
said
then
that?
watch
Yeah.
what you said that and then watch them be like, well, well, I wanted to, or well,
Yeah.
sort of, but I didn't say it like that, but, and it's like, oh shit, we're not saying what we really want to
No.
say. And then on top of that, not only do I not always, say exactly what I was thinking, but a lot of times I'm having full conversations in my head about, I might not even know that I haven't said it, but then I'm also not saying it to the right people. So not even the person who needs to hear it, but like if I said this in another episode, if I'm like, I want to drink and I'm 4.5-ish, 5 years sober. If I'm like, oh, I really want to drink, it's interesting that I'll say it to people who aren't alcoholics, but the last people I'll say it to is alcoholics. And those are the people I should say it to.
Mm-hmm.
Because those
Right.
are the people who I keep using that analogy because it's an easy one to understand. Like you could be saying the things out loud, but if you're not saying it to the person who needs to hear it or the person you're having the conflict or a situation with, or the people who are your people, it may not be quite the same thing.
Mm-hmm. No. Well, you're not going to get your needs resolved.
And yes, and also you're still keeping that secret. Like
You're
your
doing
secrets keep you
this.
sick. Yeah, you're dodging, you're weaving, you're
Yes.
avoiding, you're finding
Yes.
ways to avoid, right?
Right.
Because
You're testing.
yeah,
You're testing the waters.
right.
Right? Because if you're not used to your needs getting met and you were often rejected or you felt rejected or disappointed by others, you're likely going to express those needs to the wrong people as a way to get validation, to accumulate data in order to give yourself some strength to say it to the right person.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So
Yes.
You're testing the waters, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what people do is it. But also, you can speak to the part of that person that is advocating for themselves too, right? So someone says to you, "Yeah," and so what I said was this. There's a part of them that is saying this. Well, there's a part of them that's really advocating, and there's a part of that that's powerful, and so you then sort of help that person enlist that part.
Mm-hmm. Now, can you speak? I know you can speak on parental grief.
Oh God, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay, yes. So personal and what I see in my practice, but also what I see pervasive, right? All over the place is parents have children and they become parents and they have all bunch of unresolved grief from childhood.
AKA expectations.
Expectations, and then they vomit that on their child. Now, all of that is quite cool if you have a neurotypical child who is, fitting within the box and able to succeed and, basically makes you feel like you succeeded, right?
Right.
That you're doing a good job as a parent.
Right.
But all is very different when you birth the sort of neurodivergent types, the ones that don't, play into societal expectation of what is good.
And this could also be if you have expectations, if you're fostering or adopting a child and you had expectations for how that was going to go, like that, oh, this child would be so happy to have a home. And maybe they suffer from, some trauma from that detachment and that abandonment or whatever that is. And having the kind of expectations of like, just a parental expectation of I'm going to raise the kid this way. So they're going to be that way.
Right. And so you have to sometimes grieve what you thought. First of all, who you thought you were going to be as a parent. I'm certainly not who I thought I was going to be as a parent. Like, I thought I was going to be offering all wonderful organic, non-GMO BS, food groups, and the child would lovingly receive those food groups. And I thought that like my kid would sleep 8 hours a night because, or 10 hours a night or 11 hours, whatever.
Can I just tell you? Can I just tell you, anytime I've been in Jayda's kitchen, she's blending something and she's like, through gritted teeth, being like, I put flaxseed in here because he's got to get some kind of nutrients because the kid will only eat chicken nuggets. And then she'll throw a piece of broccoli in there. He can't taste it. But he'll actually eat this though. Like every time. Yes.
Well, I've got your neurodivergent, whatever that spectrum is, kids that are highly attuned, very sensitive to sensory feedback. One of them is, the other one is just doesn't give a shit. But like, they're both different, right? Different. And they're also very, very willful. So they're going to do what they're going to do. And so my control is futile. It doesn't work.
Yeah, you're going to have to pick and choose those battles. You can't choose them all.
Yeah, absolutely. And some parents have children with high needs, right? And those high needs are very difficult on a day-to-day basis. And it doesn't mean that they love them any less, but there is zero space to feel received by that, right? If you have a kid that struggles or has high needs, and you speak to somebody who doesn't understand that, right? So I'm speaking to people that don't understand it, not a community of people that get it, right? I'm often going to be met with a lot of invalidation and dismissing.
Right.
Have you tried this? What, did you mince the chicken in small enough? No, my kid can spot that chicken. My kid can spot that little tiny piece of pepper, right? And there is no hiding it because he's got a very intense sense of smell and taste. And so, right? So there is no advice for it,
right?
And also, as a parent with somebody who has high needs, in a society that really has an expectation that what is good and successful is very neurotypical, and
whatever that is.
Well, typical, normal, right? Like, this is successful. And
but like,
assessments.
If being a sociopath was normal, then being empathetic would be not normal.
Well, right. Empathy. So I have a theory going on. It's not necessarily validated, but empathy, empaths, people can look quite spectrum-like. Right? So they look like they're definitely neurodivergent. Some of their behaviors can look like they're on the spectrum, but what's underneath it is very different, right? It's not a neurobiological thing. It's more about like how they perceive the world and the sensitivity that comes through their body, right? And how to process that being in the world. And so, because
I just want to say, if neurotypical is based on like white men, which most things are, I don't want to be typical. I would like to not be on that scale. Like, I don't want to be, if that's the normal that everyone's striving to be, I'm good.
Yeah. And so And so I don't have your neurotypical children. They don't come from my genetics. Right. And I recognize that is really the neurotypical lens is really through a white hetero male dominant lens, and these assessments are created by white neurotypical men typically, right? You can't assess neurodivergency properly from that lens because you'll see it as deficit based, right? So it doesn't matter though, because as a parent of somebody who might be neurodivergent, even though I'm a therapist, yes, and I have all the clinical information and I have the wherewithal to recognize this, as a parent navigating a system that is constructed in a way, right, that is neurotypical, it's very frustrating. And there's a lot of grief within the system too. Like, you see where there's problems, and then what you do as a parent, or I do anyway, I have to catch myself and not projecting into the future, because at some point I will not be there to control things as if I have control, right? I will have to let go. And my children will have to flourish in the system that we've created. Now, hopefully this system is evolving. And I think it truly is, right? Based on my kids' ability to access resources and things.
Oh, yeah.
Be their best self. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and if anybody wants to come for me about the system being, white, hetero, male, normative, whatever that is. I just want to point out, where were all the ADD female cases in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s? They didn't exist. And not because women didn't have ADHD, ADD, OCD. They were not being classified the same. Their symptoms or whatever was showing, autism, all of it was not showing in women the same way it was showing in men, or in girls the way it was showing in boys. And so it just got looked over. It just doesn't affect them, that kind of thing. So
but
I'm
also
just going to add that to the mix.
neurotypical, even without like the gender lens, right? Like, boys, gendered boys, neurodivergent boys who require, a lot of feedback in their bodies to feel regulated. Well, they need to move. So our systems, our education is not really,
sit still, stop moving, stop,
right. So
quit talking, stop talking,
boys,
stop socializing.
Yes. Yeah. So even the boys, right? The girls would present more dissociated, more gone, right? And they just sort of crisscross applesauce, right? But some of the boys who are highly active, that require that feedback in their bodies, are looked as problems. That's through a neurotypical lens. And some of our girls have the same needs, right? The same need for feedback in their bodies, needing to move and whatnot.
Yes,
and they're
I was that.
Crazy, wild, right?
Yes,
right.
Social butterfly, can't stop moving, dancing all the time, like.
Yes. So you cannot, even ADD, right? It without accommodations of needs, getting your needs met, right? It's not really ADD. Right? Like, I mean, ADD in its most...
I'm just highlighting these as like, if you're not what everyone would consider normal, unfortunately, what is the status quo of like within the realm of quote unquote normal?
Yeah. My grief, my personal grief, is more about fighting a system to get the needs of my children met. It's not so much about like, oh my God, like,
they're not going to be this or that. Yeah.
No, because
it's more like
kids are pretty darn cool, right? Yeah. They're really neat. And I want to have a system that can really support their strengths. But again, in these assessments, which is my grief, my anger comes from the deficit model. It's like, if someone might need visual cues in order to learn, not just auditory, right? But that doesn't mean that they're not cognitively advanced, right? Like, or average or whatever. But these assessments really just assess based on a neurotypical lens. And so that's my fight, right? It's like, and you're getting a lot of feedback, and you're also dealing with experts too, right? And that really, use these old assessments as a way to navigate the system. And I get it.
Right. Right. Because there may not have been enough research in one way or the other, but they're still the expert for right now. And in 10, 20 years, that may be outdated, much like our little 5 stages of grief bullet point. And then I think it's also, you touched on this a little bit at the beginning of talking about parental grief, but also like some of what we would dub a stage mom or dad, right? Like someone who so desperately, like maybe they wanted to, I'm just going to use dance as an example. Like they wanted to dance as a child and they never got to. So then they enroll their kid and they like kind of live vicariously through them. Or maybe they were a dancer and they're like, my kid will dance too, and I'll be the best teacher. And the minute that kid, doesn't want to dance, B, never wanted to dance, C, doesn't, hates it and either does it to fulfill their parents' need or doesn't, and has to deal with that kind of like, riff.
Like the natural facility
right.
to do it.
All the things, So, there's, I think, a lot of room for that with parental, that kind of like grief of what you expected, right? Which could also file under ambiguous griefs, things that you had expected, wanted, and that aren't happening.
Yeah, and most people are not aware of it.
Yes,
You're not
of course
aware
not.
that exists. And if you're aware of it, then you can do something about it, right? You can redirect your behaviors in a way that is more fitting to your value system.
Right. And my hope for this episode in particular is I hope everyone on earth listens to this episode just so that they can like give themselves some validation for maybe some unprocessed grief or griefs that they have not allowed themselves to have. And I'm not even saying they have to like, go to a therapist, go to a 12-step and like really dig in, but just like acknowledge like, oh, yeah, I qualify for that. Oh, hey, they're saying that would be that would be a grief. Yeah, I have that, like that would be, I would absolutely love for that, because I think that could in itself help so many people in so many ways and in turn help kind of the world.
Yeah, it would transform. It would help transform
Right.
everything if people could just
Right.
acknowledge its existence and coexist
Right.
with it.
Right. And things that they may just not know that they have the right to have maybe in this moment. We talked before this podcast a little bit. I wanted to talk about a brief trajectory of, I know a lot of dancers listen to this podcast, or I hope a lot of dancers do. I'm a dancer. A lot of my circle is dancer. You are a dancer. A lot of your circle is still dancers or previous dancers, retired dancers, still dancing, dance teachers, whoever. I want to talk a little bit about the trajectory of what that looks like. And you could interchange this with someone who's an athlete as well. I think this is valid. I want to talk about the grief cycle of just having that as a profession, right? So I recall from the minute that I decided, I want to be a dancer, and I kind of decided that a little late, like at 16, I kind of was like, okay, I think I want to do this. And from that point on until I was able to actually
that was late.
Right. So that's already like the pressure, right? The pressure of, because like at around 16, 17, everyone was deciding what colleges they want to go to, what career path they want. And I still didn't really know. And I still wasn't like super sold on like, I want to be a dance. I eat, breathe, sleep. I mean, I danced a lot. I liked it a lot, but I was interested in performing. I was not like loving dance class. I was not like loving bar, like I didn't like to sit and go to class. I did it because it afforded me the ability to perform, but I was not someone who was like super into like being in dance class. And so I didn't understand that I could still want to do that, even though I didn't love the process of how I'd have to get there, And so that's kind of what took me a second, but yeah, 16 is not late at all, but already there's this, fast forwarded age of what this timeline is, right?
Yeah.
So you're running out of time, right? Yeah. So from 16 till about maybe 22, I want to say 22, 23, that was kind of a endless, for me, an ambiguous grief. Like, oh my God, what if this doesn't happen? Oh my God, I didn't go to college. I moved straight out to LA. I did a training program instead. I've been spending my days, weeks, hours, minutes training. Everything is leading up to hopefully having this thing. And what if it doesn't happen for me? And what if I don't get to do the thing that I came out here to do? And what if already my dreams are not going to come true? And what if I'm going to be one of those people who moves home and gives up or stays out here and doesn't do it? And like, there was quite a bit of stress and that anticipatory grief of it not happening for me that I dealt with from probably 16 to 22. And that was rough. And it kind of accumulated in almost kind of like a little mental breakdown of like, oh my God, I've been out trying for 2 years. I just keep getting no's every time. I'm getting cut. I'm getting cut. I'm getting cut. And at that point in time, there was probably 8 auditions a week and I'm getting told no and not even getting past the first cut. Or a typecast, which if anyone's unfamiliar, a typecast is where they line you all up and go down the list and just say no based on looking at you. And you don't know why. You don't. Yes, it's not like, your outfit was bad or we don't want blondes. No. They just like, please stay, thank you, please stay, thank you. And the thank you was thank you for coming, but we're not interested. And that kind of compound rejection was really starting to get to me. In addition, I was very rejection sensitive. I didn't know that at the time. Now I know that about myself. I am just rejection sensitive. So that was kind of tenfold. Then moving on from that timeline for me was working professionally. And from about 22, 23 to about, I want to say my early 30s, that's what I was doing. And I was happy doing that. And I was making it happen and it was happening and it was great. Now about my late 20s is when a lot of women around me started dropping like my peer circle, started retiring, having children, moving on, doing something different, becoming yoga teachers, going back to school for something else, getting married, having children, moving back home to be around their family. Like that's kind of when it happened, was my late 20s, early 30s. By about 35, my peer group was gone. I was the oldest for the most part, of all the jobs I was on. And that is when I had my knee injury at 35. And that was incredibly devastating because it was an ACL tear, and it was a very, very, it's a full tear. It is, you have to have a surgery, or you don't have a great prognosis for doing anything super athletic in the future. I was able that I could cope, and I was able to do some dancing, but it was significantly reduced, and I was not going to be able to dance how I really wanted to without the possibility of the surgery. I did have that surgery. I did make a full quote unquote recovery. After these things, you're never really fully in body or in mind, because there's that fear that you might do it again. And so there's all that psychology behind it. After I recovered from that injury, 35, I am now 41. Yikes. And I am geriatric in my peer group. And now, and I am now, there is not a lot of people my age that are still doing it. If they are older than me. Like they've done other things, and now they've come back. They're on like their second run of the entertainment industry, right? And in this category now, I have changed my, preferences of what kind of jobs I want to do and not do. But it is getting more like I'm not interested in a lot of the things anymore. So I have to find a way to transition somewhere else. Now, I still very much like to teach dance. I like to put on dance events. I still like to perform. I still like to dance in certain avenues. I still like being creative. I still like performing. But there's definitely an impetus of me needing to find something else or move on from a certain portion of it. And I am literally kind of the last holdout. Like it is just most, especially women, don't get into the 40s of doing this thing unless they've gone and come back, or they, it just seems to be kind of the abnormality. And so me at 40, 41, even late 30s is looking at the end, like a retirement, right? Now, most people retire at the age of 65. So at 65 or 70, whatever, they're like, I'm now done and ready to live out the rest of my life on my unemployment and live these golden years, right? That's kind of the thing that is still kind of thought of.
Most of us are not going to be doing that.
No, we're not going to be doing that for a lot of reasons, which we don't need to get into today. But like that's kind of what has been modeled previous to us. So to have a retirement, because most people at 40 are thriving in their careers. They're making the most money they've ever made. They're able to ask for the most money they've ever made. They still have about 20 years left in their careers before they would even consider something different, right? And at 35, 40 or 40, it's now the end. And that is really old for an athletic situation. Like most people, if you're a gymnast, if you're a figure skater, if you're like some of the basketball player, like those professions, that shelf life is even less. And now there are always, the exception to the rule, but they are the exception. So now there is the grief of what is next, leaving behind the things that aren't for me anymore, leaving behind the abilities that I don't have as much and have been, since my knee injury, even that has been a decline of what I can do or what my body's, able to do. And so, just to track that timeline, that's like, I had a good run there where there wasn't, as much grief other than just like the loss of jobs that I wanted. I still got told no all the time. I still was like the one person who didn't book the job of the 8 that got capped, like that shit happened to me all the time, so
okay,
I didn't avoid that.
The first thing I want to mention is this rejection sensitivity. This is a very TikTok-y sort of, idea. It's something that you're going to hear a lot that's paired with ADD, right? Is that you have this rejection sensitivity, this dysmorphia or
dysphoria.
Dysphoria. Sorry, dysphoria. Yeah. I don't think we need to call it that. I think we can just call it to like it hurts.
Yeah.
Reject it, right? We don't
Yeah,
need to
but
think
rejection
about it.
sensitivity sounds so much more professional.
Yeah,
I
it
feel like I
does.
get told, I feel like I would get taken seriously if I'm like, look, I'm just rejection sensitive.
Well, it's a barrier to experiencing, but the thing is, it just sucks, right? It
Yeah.
sucks to put your whole heart into something and to experience a no, especially when your whole
Over
heart
and
is in
over and
something
over and
over and
over
over
and
and over
over and
again, and
over and
still
over again.
show up and
Yeah.
still continue to do it anyway. Like, that's not the norm, right?
No.
That's not what quote unquote normative people do. They,
No, you
you
do
know,
one interview, maybe a couple interviews,
yes,
maybe a second interview.
yes, yes, but
But
also, yeah, but also you are building grit through the process, right? So
is
there's
that what
a
I built? Because I don't feel like I did build any of that.
well, if you sustain this long as a 41-year-old woman in an industry that really values youth, yeah, you got some grit.
What if I
Some
make
good.
Roderick bleep out every time you say my real age? I might make him bleep it out.
You have to bleep out your own.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah,
Yeah.
bleep.
Yeah, no, go ahead. I don't care.
But
Whatever.
that's the thing, is like, we're running out of time. We're running out of time. You're running out of time based on a value system that is predicated by the world. Right? We're talking about constructs that certain people have created of value based on ageism, which is also, as you begin to age, right, you really recognize that ageism is a thing, right? If you're 70 years old, well, you better retire because you don't have the cognitive prowess in order to endure really tough, stressful situations. So you're not valued. Men will experience that too, right? It's like they're less powerful once they hit a certain age. Now, who are they? That's grief, right? So as a dancer, you're just experiencing it much earlier than normal because a lot of the industry is predicated on what you look like and where you fit, right? And so, people that come back to it are most likely, hopefully, reimagining who they are. They're not like coming back.
No, yes. And this is the thing, like,
of 20.
there's also there's also the fact that as you get older, you're probably less willing to deal with bullshit. And there is so much bullshit that comes with these types of professions because it requires so much of you without getting paid. So it requires you to get ready, to show up, to put your time on the line without making a check before you can, you're already working in deficit before you can even get a job. And that is incredibly financially taxing. It's emotionally taxing. It's physically taxing. It's time taxing. It's like, so a lot of that also as you get older, unless you've had a refresher, you've stepped away from it for several years and you have like that energy back again. If you've been pretty consistent on that grind, there's a burnout that I think is just, it's just, it's
stakes.
unavoidable.
Everybody's a different process, right? Some people had a lot more support financially to endure some of the bumps. So yeah, your rejection sensitivity, can also be layered with this idea that, like, if I fail, I'm homeless.
I'm not going to survive.
I'm not going to survive. Like, my basic needs are not going to get met. That's a little scarier than if you're supported by your family system to, sort of reach your potential, which I was, right? Like, I knew for the most part that I had a safety net. Right. It was much easier for me to tolerate some of these bumps than I think if you felt like you were alone. In it. But also, someone like you, when I think about you and your career and I think about your resiliency to do so, there's so much more conviction there, which means that there's so much more at stake. And there's so much probably more, in letting go too, right? So I don't know, everybody has an individual process. But yeah, you're speaking to the shelf life being starting much earlier and ending much sooner. And what athletes and dancers, artists that use their body have to do is they have to transform beyond their body and figure out who they are beyond that much earlier than status quo.
Yeah.
So you ain't status
Yeah.
quo.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I have two last questions for you for today.
Okay.
What do you want people to know about grief? I know it's a lot, but like, can you just sum up something like
Yeah,
it can be very simplistic or it
yeah,
can, you know,
it's not gonna feel good
mm-hmm,
right away, but it's important, right? So
mm-hmm,
if I could say anything, it's like to have the courage to be with it, and hopefully you have people in your life, or you can now advocate for people in your life who can hold a space for you to endure life, to be able
mm-hmm,
to be in these moments that are hard, and they can sit in it with you. Don't try to do anything about it. There's nothing to do about it. If you start noticing control patterns or things that you're trying to do to manage it, let go. It ain't
mm-hmm,
gonna work for you. It's gonna bring you into a deeper hole.
mm-hmm. And my last question is,
That's all I got.
that's perfect. And my last question is, I like to say we don't give advice on the podcast, but I will ask for your suggestions. So, what is your suggestion for people or for someone who might be suffering right now?
Know that you're suffering, right? So the very first thing, if you think you might be suffering, you might start noticing symptoms, right? You might not be noticing maybe depressive states or anxious states or panic, like that hyperarousal, hypoarousal, sort of your nervous system feels off. You might be noticing yourself isolate. You're having a hard time. And if you
Mm-hmm,
are, if you can notice that, then you can enlist the support. And it doesn't necessarily mean therapeutic services, although I obviously strongly believe in it. But finding a therapist or finding a support group or just finding friends that can be with it. You need community. We don't do this alone.
mm-hmm.
You can't do this alone.
And I will add some links, like I always do, to access to find a therapist near you and stuff like that in the show notes. So check those out if that speaks to you. Jaayda Ellingham, licensed psychotherapist, LMFT, got a master's. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much for coming back on Gray
Of
Maybe
course.
and lending your expertise. I always love talking to you on the pod and off. I get so much free therapy. It's unethical for her to charge me or say she's giving me therapy, but she can't help it. So, you know, appreciate you, and I'm so glad you're back.
Yeah, I love you.
Love you too. Thank you.